Alex M. H. Smith, welcome to the Work and Worldview podcast. Pleasure to have you. Learn so much from you through the materials you provide online, through your book, No BS Strategy, and through a group that was basically formed as a result of some of the material you shared online. So very thankful to be here with you.
Oh, well, thanks a lot for having me. And yeah, very gratified and surprised that people are bonding indirectly over the strategy shtick. It shows that there's an audience for everything.
All right. So beginning every interview, the way I begin interviews is tell me a little bit about the home you grew up in, the values you had there as a young person.
I find the word, it's funny for someone who bangs on about unique value, but I actually find the word values extremely difficult to understand or define. If someone asked me, what are your values, or what is the value of your home life, I would actually struggle to answer that question. But I grew up in the countryside with my parents and my sister, and dogs and cats and horses and all of that. And both of my parents were accountants. Well, my mum, she quit when I was born, but my dad, he worked for KPMG, and it's been always a very it's a sort of classic, we would say in England, a professionals sort of
Mm-hmm.
household. So
Mm-hmm.
that is the sort of like the cultural niche that we fell into, and that I was always operating from as well. I'm not entrepreneurialism of any sort, never remotely occurred to me, and we didn't know anyone who did anything like that. It was very much a world of accountants, lawyers, doctors. This is the sort of thing that you do for work. And that's something that has, on the one hand, served me well going through with my career in some ways, but it's also a big thing that I've had to really unlearn a lot. But other than that, it was just really a really just classic, reasonably idyllic sort of British middle class upbringing. It's the water that I swim in, so it's hard for me to observe it from the outside and see it as being anything but normal. And maybe that's where the values are. One of the reasons why they're not impossible, but difficult to define, in that they can only really be defined in their negation, and if you have experience of what an alternative life would look like. But but frankly, I don't. Although now that I think about it, I can compare, for example, to my wife, who is Swiss, and and she also came from a sort of two parents, three kids, suburban Geneva life. And if I compare, so though if I can compare those two families and see that we were her family, everyone's very sort of like independent, and it was quite that sort of like when you're above a certain age, it's like, right, you're on your own kind of thing. And whereas in our family, it's kind of the opposite of that. My parents, I think my dad was still paying my phone bill when I was like 30 years old. It's that kind of thing. Like, I'm like completely dependent and utterly coddled person. So this is something that again, to an extent, it has its positive things, but I had to unlearn, because I've been very looked after, and that's made me sort of very lazy, and actually quite not very risk taking, which again is funny given like the spiel that I put out there,
Mm-hmm.
and the stuff that I say. Um, so again, this is all stuff that I had to add, let's say, to my repertoire. And most of my writing, as with anyone's writing, most of my writing is just me telling myself stuff that I didn't know before. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a reflection of, it's not it's not a reflection of who I am. It's a reflection of who I am not and who I am trying to be. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So it's aspirational in the sense of you're identifying ideals to strive toward and actively doing that sort of in real time yourself.
Exactly. And then all of the true things that are actually embedded in my DNA, which you might call the kind of like the bedrock values, to me, those are pretty much invisible. So it's not that they aren't there, but like it's
Mm-hmm.
much easier for me to talk about values that I aspire to than values that I have built in.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay.
You know how
So,
we, I mean, sorry, just as an analogy, you know how you'll often hear people say that like Western society, even in its secular forms, is built on an implicit bedrock of like Christian theology, but people
mhm,
don't realize it because it's so because it's so because it's so integral. Um, and there are assumptions which everyone thinks are just common sense, but which actually aren't common sense. They are very kind of like particular to that worldview.
mhm,
So I think it would be the same for any, never mind a society, I think it would be the same for any individual, that you have a bedrock theology, for want of a better word, that you're living to,
mhm,
but which you completely take for granted. And you think to yourself, this is just common sense, isn't it? This is just normal. This is just what normal people think. This is just what normal people are like. When actually, that's very far from the truth.
mhm, mhm. Was your home a religious home?
Medium. So yes, but not to the extent of weekly church attendance. In the UK, uh, it would be very unusual to go sort of weekly because there's no culture around it, and so then it's like you have a big that gives a sort of big kind of inbuilt barrier. If you're going to go there and there's going to be like three people there, is very different than if you're going to go there and there's going to be 300 people there. So sort of nominally, but not behaviorally.
Gotcha. Gotcha. But yeah, there's definitely influence there. And to your point, so so I saw in your history you came to the States for a while. You attended school in Illinois.
But yeah. Best year of my life. That was amazing. ILLINI. Uh, I was always incredibly drawn to America and American culture and all of that stuff. And the only thing I really wanted out of university was to have a year abroad in America. So like that was I wasn't doing anything vocational for my studies, like law or medicine or whatever. So it was all just really a way of passing the time and then being able to have that experience. So that was great. I was in, all in like the fraternity culture. I was social chair, Phi Kappa Psi, all that. I was like, give me the stereotype. I want the most stereotyped American college experience that you can possibly have. And basically, I got it. That's something that I always say about America. I think that unlike other places in the world that I've been to, everything in America is exactly what you expect, for better and worse. Like it never fails to match your expectations.
Mm,
Um,
okay.
whereas like if you go to Paris, right, we all have this like image of Paris in our head, that kind of like Amelie, Ratatouille, whatever image of Paris. Now, frankly, you go to Paris and it isn't like that at all. Like Paris is like 80% just like H&M and a normal kind of city. And then you have these like little pockets where you feel, oh, that's quite Parisian. Let's take a picture of that lamppost kind of thing. But Paris as a whole is not Paris, if you understand what I
Mhm,
mean. But
mhm.
if you go to like Chicago, is Chicago. It's exactly how it is in the movies, and it's exactly how you think it's going to be. And like that what you see is what you get. So that's what I
Okay.
mean by that.
All right. Glad there's integrity there.
There is integrity, as I say. For some people would say that's a negative thing, but no, I was super into all that.
So here's a random question no one's asked you before, I'm sure. So you find yourself in college in the States, in Urbana, and it's Thanksgiving Day. Today's Thanksgiving Day here. So that's always
Oh,
an
it is.
interesting thing
Happy
for,
Thanksgiving.
yeah. Yeah. So today, so that's always an interesting thing for international students. So how did you spend Thanksgiving Day that year?
That is a really good question, and that no one has ever asked me, but I can remember it extremely vividly. So I went with a pal of mine called Kale, who lived in Springfield, Illinois. I went to have Thanksgiving with his family, and like it was like this was like a sort of, again, speaking of living up to stereotypes and whatever, this was a very deep American experience. They were quite sort of like, well, I guess like a European person would call them, they were sort of quite rednecky. They were very like serious, like proper Americans. I remember that like one of his buddies turned up in his truck with a couple of like deer that he'd shot with his bow just in the flat back of the truck on the day. So it was that kind of like experience. And what was also funny on that day is that on the very same day, my dad texted me to say that he was on the train, quite literally in the same train carriage as the Queen. So you can imagine, to all my American hosts, they figure, well, that must just be what happens in the UK, that you're often riding in the train with the Queen. So you had a good kind of, I mean, I didn't even realize that the Queen took the public train, but she did. And so you had a good kind of like culture clash moment there. And I can remember being horrified by that dish, the the sweet potatoes with like marshmallow melted on it or something.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like, what the hell is this? I did not like that.
Did you do a polite no thank you bite or no?
I did. Yeah, yeah. I was pretty scandalized by that, but yeah, good experience.
That's great. Alex, so let's forward beyond that. So, it's interesting what you said earlier, because I would certainly characterize you as one who's almost an expert at contrarian thinking, right?
Mhm.
Observing the crowd, identifying where the mass is, and saying, there's even an image in your book. You have a cluster of circles, and you're like, that's not where you want to be. You want to be outside that, right? So it's interesting to hear your background is more normalized and you're more aspirational. But just curious, how did you get from sort of where you were to where you are today in terms of career choices,
Ah,
and like this, you know, there was some, back to values, there was some sort of values that you started absorbing and living by that developed into what you are today.
well,
So
now you see, this is the thing. So this is why you need someone else like yourself point these things out to you. And now that you mention it, the thread is actually pretty clear on that. So like both my parents, but my dad in particular, are extremely contrarian, and this was really my dad's sort of brand. And he was a partner at KPMG, but he was one of those sort of, he is a real intellectual. My
mhm.
dad, he would have been much better off as a university professor than a professional. With no exaggeration, in his house, their house, our house, he's got about 50,000 books, and that's not including about another 20, 30,000 on the Kindle. Um,
Wow.
so, and he was always very, I know it's hard to imagine in the context of being a partner at KPMG, being an accountant, but he was always very rebellious at work. This is all part, and he sort of held himself back. This is what people say anyway, from more career success by just like, kind of being bloody minded and contrarian and just sort of like all that sort of stuff. So that always then did run very deep, actually, now that you mention it, in the family. So um so I suppose I always then so I suppose I actually did always carry that through. Um but and then just like my dad, it was extremely destructive for me originally, earlier in my career, because then so I went to so I went to university. Other than the year abroad, it was a complete waste of time, really. I think I made the wrong choice about what to do. Da da da. Um, but anyway, I came out of there, and my first two jobs were at EY and L'Oreal. And so EY, obviously, to some extent, following in the family footsteps.
Hmm.
Um, and I got fired from there. And then L'Oreal, in marketing, and I also got fired from there. So in both cases, like I fit in, like I was a real, what's the analogy? Like turd on the patio or something. Like it was bad for me in both of those places because I just like, I mean, I was all, they were right and I was wrong. But like, I was just very disruptive. And I don't mean disruptive like, oh, I was this amazing, creative, disruptive sort of thinker. And it was more just like, particularly when you're a junior and in a big organization like that, they don't want you to be questioning everything. They just want you to be like, yes, sir, no, sir, and just get on with it and just like, and earn your dues. And you're not, you know, these are pretty well-oiled machines and they have ways of
Mhm.
doing things and
Yeah.
that, are not fundamentally stupid. This is the way these companies work, and they don't need the new grad coming in and being like, "Oh, why are you doing it that way? That's stupid." Da, 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 which is what I was doing. Now, I mean, probably my points were valid, but that's complete. But that doesn't matter because that's just like it's completely redundant whether my points were valid or not. You're just not. You're just breaking the. You're breaking the kind of social contract which is inherent in a job like that.
Mhm.
So I was very much having a sort of experience rather like my dad, albeit he didn't like things up quite as much as I did. Um, and so then I was uh, and so then I was out of there, and I was unemployed for 6 months. And I always what I always really wanted, but not for any reason other than that it looked cool in the movies, was I always wanted to be in advertising because this was the time when that was the aspirational career. Nowadays, it's completely unaspirational and it just seems to be dead, basically. Or like it's not where that it's not where talent wants to go anymore. But back in those days, that is where talent wanted to go. I have this theory. I want to. This is going to be my next newsletter. So you heard it here first. I've got this idea. I call it the RomCom career matrix, and the concept is that you can tell what the most desirable talent magnet industry is by what the jobs are that people in rom-coms have in different eras. At that time, people in rom-coms would always either work in advertising or they would work for a magazine like Vogue or something like that. You'd
Mhm.
often get man works in advertising and the woman works for a magazine. That would be often how it would pan out. So I wanted to work in advertising, but like I couldn't get a job. I couldn't even get an interview. No one was like remotely interested. Like I couldn't get anywhere near to any of the big the big advertising agencies. Um, but the best that I could do eventually was not through applying, but through like a friend of a friend of a friend kind of thing. I could I got to go and be like a junior account executive in an experiential marketing agency, which is a little bit like advertising, albeit like it was a bit more geared towards, product sampling and much less kind of sexy creative work. But it was still working in the agency world. And so that was something. And then when I went to that company, like it was a much, much more natural fit because I think that the fundamentally small businesses, this was like a 50 person business. Small businesses are open to people saying, hey, why do we do it like this? And being a bit more like disruptive because obviously a small business doesn't have all their figured out yet. It's not like, they aren't this like well-oiled
Mhm.
ship or whatever.
Mhm.
So so then I had a very good time there. So that was my first. That was then like working in a small business at that time. It just suited.
So you get into the small business, so now you have a foothold and you're actually consistently working somewhere. At some point, you must have started to identify some of the patterns that are, I would consider your trademark now, just in terms of uh, clustering, sameness, identifying what stands out, starting to see trends around, things that differentiate themselves. Is that when that started coming into focus?
These were all very present, but I just wasn't conscious of them at all. Again, it's only with hindsight that I can see it now.
Hmm.
So um, there was no strategy offering with strategy department within this agency. Obviously, a lot of agencies do strategy now. They pretty much all do. That particular that particular part of the industry at that time had no strategy at all. You had creative and then you had delivery. and I was in the delivery part of the equation. I thought, okay, well, there's no way that obviously it's much cooler to be a creative, but I was like, well, I can't be a creative because, I don't know InDesign and whatever all the software is they're using and all that kind of stuff. I cottoned on to vaguely that like big sexy agencies do this thing called strategy. And I didn't know anything about it other than to say that it sort of was halfway between creative and what the account managers were doing. And I
Hmm.
thought, oh, well, that would be more sexy than what I'm currently doing, which is like, filling in stock sheets for like yogurt and stuff like that. Um, but obviously there was no one in the business who could teach me this. There was no track record in the business. So I said there was a bit more to it than this, but basically I said to the boss, I said, hey, why don't you let me like set this up and then we can have like a strategy department, and won't that be a good look in a pitch, et cetera, et cetera. And by that point, I'd sort of earned enough internal credibility for him to let me have a go at that. And so this is where my way of learning strategy and my way of everything that I do ultimately, to your point, has been kind of observational. So, I knew enough to be able to look at, a successful campaign and just say, all right, well, what does this campaign have that other campaigns sort of don't? And then you just post rationalize that into, well, whatever that missing thing is, we'll call that strategy. And so
Okay.
this is then how I was kind of like approaching strategy. And even like a lot of it is was just about post rationalizing the creative idea. You just let the creative come up with 10 ideas, and then I would just be like, well, I can create a rationale for that idea, but I can't really explain why these other ideas are worthwhile. So we'll go with that one and we'll pretend that I started with the rationale rather than that we started with the idea. Uh, and incidentally, this is like how like most strategy does and should work anyway. You just start with the idea and then you post rationalize it. I'm not a fan of pre-rationalization. So this was all of those habits coming out. And then they really kicked on when I was thinking more broadly about like what I then became interested in is like, isn't it funny how some companies don't do advertising or creative marketing at all? Some companies don't even bother. And I became really interested in these types of companies. So Tesla, Lush, Monster, these are sort of examples of businesses who don't do that. And my only real observation I had about them was, well, these companies are just so inherently interesting that they don't need to fake interestingness by doing a whole bunch of like advertising stuff.
If you've already subscribed, thank you very much. If you haven't subscribed, would you please do so? It helps. Thank you.
And so then I developed this whole thesis around these type of businesses, and I thought I could sell this to businesses like and my original kind of sort of tagline, if you like, was make interesting companies, not interesting advertising. So you could see that I was coming at it from a very sort of like advertising lens, because that's where I was coming. And I thought, this is what I want to sell. Wouldn't it be cool if there was an agency that instead of selling media based campaigns was actually selling, making the fabric of the business interesting and sexy and whatever. And so this is then where I was post rationalizing my whole sort of like IP. And this was impossible to sell. It didn't work, this idea. But what I
Really?
no, because the reason it didn't work is because, I mean, there's a lot of reasons it didn't work. The main one is that I have to tell people this all the time now. You can't sell by educating. You can't sell something by explaining to someone, listen, I know that you don't give a shit about what I'm about to tell you, but let me just explain why this is so good. And by the time I finished explaining it, you're going to be like, oh, wow, Alex, that's such a good point. Yeah, let's do that. People buy what they think that they want, and you can't move them beyond that. So it was too novel a concept. And the other issue with it is that because I was coming at it from the advertising lens, it seemed like the sort of thing that the marketing team of a client would buy. But a marketing team, generally speaking, they don't have the remit over the client business that is necessary to implement work like that.
Hmm.
All
Hmm.
the things that didn't work. But what
Hmm.
I just didn't realize at the time is that I was like basically building a kind of mirror image or like kind of shadow version of business strategy, which was a field that I knew nothing about. I didn't know anything about marketing, advertising, campaign strategy. when I was at Sense, that agency, but I just kind of post-rationalized it to enough of a degree that, well, regardless of what other agencies are doing, all I can tell you is that clients really liked the way that I was doing it. So in that respect, it was successful. We were very successful with it at the time, rightly or wrongly. And then it was just then the same thing. Then I was accidentally post-rationalizing business strategy in the same manner, which again, I only realized quite a lot later that this is what I'd done. I only realized it when I did a TEDx about my whole sort of thesis. And then someone in the comments said something like, "Oh, this is basically just blue ocean strategy." And I never even heard of this book. And I was like, "Blue ocean strategy, what is that?" And like 2 years later, I got round to reading it, and I was just like, everyone's just going to think that I just copied this book. No, I thought I had all of these like cool ideas, and actually these are just old ideas. Like I say, it was, the important thing is that because I post-rationalized it rather than learning it from a book, is at least it enabled me to deliver that same material with a different flavor. And then that's obviously been where I've sort of built my brand out. It's like, it's not like I'm not saying things that have never been said before by any means, and I would never claim to. I'm just saying things perhaps in a way that hasn't been said before. And it's the, I'm more about style than substance at the end of the day.
Give yourself a little more credit. There's a term you used back there, pre and post rationalizing. Why don't you just expand upon that if you could for folks that don't have a reference point?
Well, if you want another value, if you like, this isn't going to sound right, but I can't think of a better way, a quicker way of just explaining it. One of my values, you might say, is that I'm sort of very anti science, not as in like anti, like don't make medicine or something like that, or whatever. But what I mean is, you have the scientific worldview, which you might sort of equate with the left-brained worldview, and then you have the more, for want of a better term, spiritual worldview, which you might associate with a more sort of right-brained worldview. One of these is about breaking things down into their parts and seeing how they work and sort of putting it back together again, which is obviously sort of how science works. And then the other one is more about taking a sort of a gestalt picture of the situation and developing broad hypotheses based on pattern observation, rather than any specific data. And there's a place obviously for both of these ways of being and ways of doing, and different people have got different abilities in one respect or the other. But like, I am very much the latter. There's some amazing books written about this whole thing. The main one being The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist, which I would strongly recommend people read, albeit it is like a 2,000-page book, so it is like not exactly. You can look up the summary. um, and the thing is, strategy. This is one of my big opinions on strategy, and I think one of the reasons why I've managed to sort of make hay with strategy is that strategy is an extremely profoundly unscientific discipline, but which has somehow, for various reasons, been cloaked in the language and style of science. Because we've come through this period, I think we're out of it a little bit now, but certainly like most of the last 20 years, you have this like, there's been this kind of like generalized idea that like science equals truth. And so then like, anytime you're trying to figure out something about the world or you're trying to come up with an idea, the scientific methodology is the way of doing that. But this is so wrong-headed, I can't even begin to describe it, right? Because it's like science is, without going into like the bigger thing about it, like science is very good for certain types of tasks. The scientific method is very bad for other types of tasks. Very, very bad for strategy, because you can't kind of like go through a sort of, because strategy is about kind of like speculative behavior about, hey, what if we did this? And then you're working in a realm where there are no proofs because the level of complexity is too high to chunk it down in a scientific way. If you're looking at how to kind of like, if you're doing knee surgery, that's a very scientific thing because a knee is sufficiently simple that we can kind of chunk it down into a predictable system that we can manipulate. The market, the economy, the world, human life, you can't do that with, because the level of complexity is too high. So that's when instead you have to deal with, instead of a very high resolution narrow picture, which is scientific, you have to deal with a very low resolution broad picture, which is the other Gestalt intuitive, let's say, perspective. And that's fundamentally always going to be what you're doing with strategy, because you need to be able to look at the entire picture, the entire landscape as one. You can't chunk it down. You have to look at everything as one thing. And then you have to intuit the hypothesis from that. When you have the hypothesis, you can start to become more strategic. You can start to interrogate it and question how this is going to work, but you can't come up with things that way. So going back to the point about post versus pre-rationalization is more kind of scientific, but whereas post-rationalization is a little bit more like, we'll just kind of like we'll come up with something in a much more sort of intuitive manner, where we don't really have any, where we're relying almost like on our subconscious to
Mm-hmm.
do the heavy lifting for us. And we're like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know why, but this just feels right. This just feels like something that would work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Therefore, let's explore it. And again, even with the, and yeah, like Rory Sutherland, obviously people like Rory Sutherland, he actually specifically said, he's obviously an ad man, so he knows how the game works. He says that, there's much more good ideas that you can post-rationalize than pre-rationalize, because the linear pre-rationalization path is so narrow that you're only going to end up with this sliver of possibilities. All
Mm-hmm.
the other possibilities that exist outside of that, you can never end up at those possibilities, because there actually isn't a linear path that you can take to get them. Or if there is, you're never going to think of it, right? You're just it's never going to come up. You're never going to be able to do it. But you could just jump straight to the end of the process, and then you see those possibilities and you're like, well, I don't know, but the reaction that you want is if you say, wow, that's cool. That's a cool idea, right? That's the feeling that you want to have about a strategy. That's the feeling you want to have about a business. That's the feeling you want to have about an idea. If you think that something is cool, that isn't a flippant signal. That is an incredibly meaningful, powerful, and deep signal that is worth unpacking, because like an idea being cool is much, much, much more significant than an idea being right or correct or sensible. There's even like, I mean, interestingly, even in the world of sort of very high science, they kind of go full circle and they end up back in this place. This physicist, Paul Dirac, is one of the big legendary fathers of physics. He has this quote where he says, a theory of beauty is more likely to be correct than a theory that fits the data. Now, unpack that, right? It tells you everything that you sort of need to know. So, like, it is a higher form of knowing, and even within the rarefied world of science, people would accept that. So, what we have to do is we have to tap into that higher form of knowing. We have to embrace it, and we have to do it deliberately. And what we sure as hell should not be doing is pretending that we're doing a scientific process just because it makes us look smart, or because we think that that's what a client or whatever wants to hear. Sorry, that was a real like rant to your like
That's
why
beautiful.
it's rationalization. There's some values coming through there for sure.
Absolutely. A bunch of them. Um, it's beautiful. And there's a bunch of angles on it too. I mean, you think, God, there's so many. It's just for example, someone's going to go get a PhD in some sort of scientific field. There has to be an initial creative spark that chooses the direction that they're going to go. Right. Like they don't, it's got to be some sort of gut. Like, I think I should explore this. I think I should press into this. And then they'll find data, they'll test that. Right. But, I like what you said about cool versus fitting the data. And I think also of like design thinking. And, an important part there is walk with your customer, understand their world, understand where they're at, begin defining their problems, but then ideate and just think of a whole bunch of ideas, right? Brainstorm and be open to that. And it's what I hear you sort of saying in parallel about strategy is generate a lot of ideas, and then which one sort of comes into focus or stands out as one worth pursuing from the many,
Yeah, yeah.
as
Although
you go
what
forward.
you're completely, although what you'll actually find, the way that the pattern shakes out more often is that, to be clear, you need to know a lot about the thing that you are strategizing for before you can
Mhm,
just then start riffing, right? So I'm not
mhm,
saying that, like, you don't need to know anything, you don't need to have any research, you don't have any data. You do. The more information that you can have up front, the better.
mhm.
But to
Yeah.
your point, you you learn all that stuff, and then you can just kind of put it aside and say, right, okay, never mind about all of that. Now what are we going to do?
Mhm,
Because you know that, like, it's percolating in the back of your mind. You know that it's doing its job. And you're putting faith in, like, the power of your subconscious mind, if you like, to just do what it needs to do. You don't need to manual override it. But actually, rather than you ending up coming up with loads of ideas and saying which one of these feels right, what normally happens is that, like, one idea just emerges and insists on itself, without you even having to come up with anything. It just sort of falls out
mm,
if you are if you're engaging with the process in a proper spirit. So you aren't really saying, which of these three ideas do I like? It's you more get to a point where you feel like there is no other possibility that I can even imagine working than this one.
mhm, mhm, mhm. So what does that look like in your interaction? So you generally, if I remember correctly, you generally work with, like, the CEO or top people in the company to do this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, after a certain size of business, you might get other people other than the CEO doing it.
Mhm,
If it was, a giant corporate or whatever. But yeah, the main bit of the work, um, is, well, it's funny because, like, there's something slightly disingenuous about the content that I put out there in many ways, because all the sort of content and instructions that I give people, a lot of it I don't do myself, because I'm just trying to, again, post rationalize stuff that I'm doing without thinking about it. Now, again, I don't know what it's like to be in someone else's head. So I don't know how other people are kind of engaging with the world. So it just so happens that I do all of this stuff, like, with absolutely zero effort. It's just a quirk. Um, but then, presumably other people are not doing that. So that's why then you need to kind of, like, chunk it down in, I must say, a more scientific way, in order that people can actually then start to sort of simulate some of the process. Because in my process, all I really do, after you learn about the business, so you just got to do your homework. Then I get together with whoever the direct parallel is. And I'd like this to just be one on one, maybe one on two. I don't like to have any more people than that. We get together for maybe like 3 half days, um, and uh, and we just sort of shoot the shit. There is no workshop. There are no post-it notes. There's no structure. I don't, frankly, even go in with a question. I might just have one question in mind to get the ball rolling, um, to sort of clear the pipes. And then I just figure that, like, by the time we finish talking, we're going to know what we need to do. Now, that's extremely unhelpful advice for somebody trying to do this work themselves. So, I don't, like, advise that as a technique. Um, you need to have really, like, imbibed all of the assumptions of strategy to do that. And that's one of the things I find interesting about strategy, is that the greatest strategists in history did not learn strategy, as far as I know, or they weren't, like, ex McKinsey alums or people with MBAs and stuff. And yet, so why was Steve Jobs so effortlessly strategic out of the box, basically? Um, what we can learn from that is that, like, this, again, this also again compares it to like law or medicine or something. You can't just, nobody is like an effortless doctor straight out of the box. You have to learn the anatomy of the body and shit like that, right? Again, so again, like this goes back to the point I was saying before. Strategy is not like that. You could just be a complete ignoramus who is just magically amazing at strategy. That is possible. There are people like that, and they often become billionaires and whatnot. So like, you know, it can be this completely effortless, intuitive process, but only if your brain, for whatever quirky reason, naturally has these assumptions built in as part of its kind of OS. And maybe up to a point, I am a person who has these assumptions built in as part of my OS, and I didn't like. Obviously, I've added to them, and it's not like I've never learned anything. Obviously, I have learned stuff, but I was probably already had an inclination towards it. But I recognize that, you know, like there also needs to be a kind of manual override way of doing strategy for people who aren't kind of exercising this muscle all day, every day, which of course most people aren't. Most people have got other stuff to do. So that's when, yeah, bottom line, do as I say, don't do as I do. Because the way that I do it is only a function of just writing all this shit about strategy every day for like a decade. Like eventually it's going to permeate. You know what I mean?
I keep thinking of Rick Rubin as you're talking. Like you're kind of the Rick Rubin because he talks about
the same thing.
It's the same thing. You know, he talks about how he intuits, right? Like he gets together with a band and he doesn't bring a playbook. He doesn't, you know, he meets with them, listens to what they're doing, intuits and provides feedback. And then, you know, basically effectively forms a strategy on how they're going to approach their material.
Exactly. I mean, this really bothers me about like some of the AI discourse is that like I feel like people just have this assumption that AI is smarter than a person. Okay, well, firstly, it's a stupid comparison to make because like an LLM and a brain are two different things, right? They're not you're not comparing like for like. It's an illusion that they're a similar.
Mm-hmm.
So firstly, it's a stupid comparison, but secondly, the human brain has got powers that far, 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 far surpass what any of the AIs have. Like there are obviously things that an AI can do that a human brain can't do, but we got to recognize that vice versa is also true. And we need to know how to tap into the things that we are better than AI at. And that the sort of the surface level non-intuitive mind, obviously AI's version of that is much more effective than a human's version of that. But this type of thing that we're talking about here, like the human mind is so much more powerful. And I think of all these people out there who are outsourcing too much of their decision making to something which they don't even realize is stupider than them.
Mm.
And yeah, that just, you know, that just really bothers me. You have to back human genius sometimes, which isn't to say that every person is going to outperform an AI. No, probably like 9 times out of 10, the AI is going to outperform a given person, no matter what
Mm-hmm.
it is. I get
Mm-hmm.
that, but like at the edges, you know, it's there are still things that where the human being can't be replaced, and where the powers of the human being move into a realm that we cannot unpack or explain, but we can still lean into and utilize.
Mm. I think you're onto something very deep and important there for our culture, our collective culture today.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I think so. And I mean, which again, I think it just comes back to the the science thing, because again, if you just make the mistake of thinking like, well, at the end of the day, a human brain is just a computer, then of course you could then follow through with that and say, oh, well, so is the AI, but it's a much more powerful computer. Ergo, it's
Mm-hmm.
better. But like
Mm-hmm.
but you're just making a category error from the very get go.
Mm-hmm. And, just to their side, there are definitely areas, of course, where it's going to exceed, but that's aside from the point. Like the point is creativity, intuition, integrity, uh, dignity, right? Like one of the areas I'm exploring and will probably be a series of podcasts is about how AI cannot recognize human dignity. Um,
Can you,
and as a
can you expand on that?
I'm sorry.
Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah. Again, so Christian worldview here, right? Seeing man is made in God's image, imbued with dignity, right? That is something that is impossible for AI to recognize simply because it will subsume God in its knowledge graph as a category, right? Under like one item, one node in a category underneath religion or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
sure.
right. So
Yeah.
as a result, when you come to a place where you make the mistake of entrusting AI to make, say, moral decisions, like perhaps an insurance company might about, do we do this? Do we do that? Right. Uh, if God and human dignity are somewhere below, then you will have profit-based decisions that are very smart and cute, but they won't necessarily honor human beings. And
Yeah,
it
and
extends it extends into areas like safety as well, like some of the areas where the AI ethicists are trying to work safety angles.
I agree, and I think it's also like, but then there's also just like I don't know, I haven't ever articulated this, but like as well with some of this stuff, like part of the dignity, not just of man, but of any animal, even maybe any organism, is that you you need to do what you were made to do in order to become a fully realized version of yourself. So when you see the bird somersaulting through the waterfall and flying for the sake of sort of pure joy, and it is like
Mhm,
just a bird being fully a bird, and there is no, and within that there is no like, hang on, is this bird doing some sort of mating ritual in order to propagate its species, or is this bird like hunting for food, or no, maybe
mhm,
the bird is actually just like fulfilling its telos as a creature, and
mhm,
that is the highest value of all, more so than the bird eating or reproducing. And then of course it's the same thing with people. Like, I mean, it's a bit like, I mean, it's, you could debate over what the equivalent sort of telos of a person is, but the point is that like, it's sometimes the doing of this stuff is what counts, and it's not about like how well you do it, and it's not about the utility of it, and it's not about like, does this generate like XYZ, like better or worse benefits. And if we take like, at the moment, AI can't sort of do strategy, let's say, in any kind of like real sense for you, to just use that as to use that as an example. But let's just say that it could. Well, like then what is the point? Just what is the point? Why don't we just curl up and die? Because don't we want to actually, feel the blood in our veins and the wind on our face, and to actually just like live as full human beings? And I care about that more than I care about like, is the strategy good or bad, or like, so we just lose sight with this overly utilitarian mindset that like
mhm,
human beings just need to embody being a person above all else. Um,
mhm,
and with my own work, sometimes I think that like I could not give two shits about strategy. This is not a subject that I'm interested in. When I was at school, university, whatever, I was never like, oh, I want to go and do strategy. I mean, like I said, I intuited the thing without even. I could have gone and read one of those books before, but I didn't, because I didn't care, because I had zero interest, and I still have zero interest now. But the key bit of doing the work, the bit that I described when you're like working with the client, is a real kind of like sort of flow state sort of experience for me, which feels very natural and right. And it feels like not doing something that I personally am meant to do. I think it's more like doing something that a person is meant to do. And I feel like I'm using parts of my humanity that need to be used and that feel good to be used in the same way as like the bird feels good when it's flying.
Hmm.
Um, and I get satisfaction from that. And my satisfaction that I derive from that has got absolutely zero to do with caring about the client's business or what the results of the strategy are going to be or anything else. It is just a process that is worthwhile for its own sake.
Mm. It's very powerful. You recognize it that way. So this goes back to the book Flow, right? You read that book?
I never read it, but I'm sort of familiar with the general idea, I guess.
Yeah, I think the idea is percolated out there enough, and
Yeah.
um, it's definitely a powerful tool in the sense that he identifies all these different case studies of people who've experienced flow and how they've experienced it. And I like the diversity that he chooses, in terms of a lot of different people. Does it give you joy doing the work you do?
I mean, I suppose it probably does. I mean, again, joy, a bit like values, joy is one of those things where I don't know if I know it when I see it, kind of thing. The day-to-day doing of the work, coming in here and sitting at my computer all day and answering emails and doing all of that shit, no, not at all.
Yeah, of course.
It's fine. It's better than most jobs. So like it's not bad. It's fine.
Hmm.
I definitely wouldn't ascribe the word joy to it. But the flow state elements, I suppose, do. I did have one experience not so long ago where I just had a big kind of win with my work
Hmm.
with a client, where like it was like biggest of big and exciting clients, and the work was just like really cool. And I sort of presented it internally, and they were just going sort of like mad for it, and the energy was so up. And I was abroad, so I had to fly there, so it was all like the whole thing was very glamorous, right? Uh, and I came out, I came out of the meeting, and I was sort of like floating on a cloud, and I was like, this is just really, really cool that like I can that I can come here and I can just give my kind of like natural sort of, you might say, integrity driven sort of thoughts, and the client said they were so inspired, blah blah blah, and so that's the sort of response that you want. So then you're sort of like touching these other people, and again, like and I just paused at that moment, and I was like, wow, this is like a real peak. And again, like fundamentally, it's trivial. It's completely trivial. This company, what happens to this company, my company, what happens to me, that is all trivial, really. But the kind of the sense of, I don't know what the right word is, but the sense of kind of rightness and kind of rhythm and sort of, yeah, this is just not a good way of describing it. The sort of almost like the musicality of the moment was just like, that was good. That was good,
Hmm. Hmm. That's awesome. That's a very special experience, I imagine. Unfortunately, so many people's lives and careers don't ever touch that. They're grinding, doing whatever.
I mean, I was speaking to a pal of mine the other day, or sort of like he sometimes helps me with some bits and pieces, and he was sort of saying like, oh yeah, I just really need to like, do something more with my career and sort of kind of thing. Um, and I said to him like, uh, I said to him, yeah, it's tough, but then, most people, they never actually really necessarily do anything that they get much meaning from with their careers. But I said, do you have any hobbies? And he said, yeah, he's sort of like super into cycling and like really into cycling. And he like does races and stuff. And I was like, what do you do on, like, a given Tuesday night? Like, you finish your work and you've put the kids to bed or whatever. What do you do? And he said, oh yeah, I'll go and, like, train. I'll, like, do 20K on the bike. And I was like, what? Like, let me tell you that 7 days a week, after I put the kids to bed, I have my dinner on my lap in front of the TV 7 days a week, right? I've got no, if you judge it by that way, I've got no life whatsoever. But but ultimately, I'm sort of, I'm like fine with that. But it's quite pathetic. But I suppose that I get my kicks from the stuff that I was just talking about before, so I don't necessarily feel the need to top it up. But the point is I was like, well, I said to this guy, it's like, look, maybe in your 9 to 5, you're doing less interesting stuff than me, but outside of that, I'm just watching TV and you've got this, like, passion, and I would love to have a passion. I would love to have a hobby. And unfortunately, I just don't really. I'm just, like, a bit sort of sad that way. And so maybe in the end, it all nets out. Not for everybody, I suppose, but just generally speaking, maybe you just naturally balance it out with the way that you live your life.
Humans are human, and they're going to find joy somewhere, and they're going to find purpose and meaning in something, right?
I hope so. I'm not sure in practice that's true, but it should be true.
Well, good. Alex, this has been awesome. I really thank you for taking time to join me here on Working Worldview. And, any other thoughts you might want to share?
Not really. It was just nice to talk about some different stuff for once, I suppose.
Yeah.
Nice to sit here, not just unpacking what is unique value. So yeah, it's cool.
How can people best find you who want to engage with you and work with you?
I made a special landing page for podcasts, which has got a whole bunch of resources and the videos you can check out and the book and all that stuff, the newsletter. If you go to basicarts.org/welcome, I've sort of bundled all of that stuff there. And then, of course, LinkedIn is the place where I am most active. But you've got to search Alex M.H. Smith, because otherwise Alex Smith is obviously an unsearchable name.
Many hits. All right. Alex, thanks so much for joining me. This has been fantastic. I appreciate it.
Cheers, man. I enjoyed it.